Good evening. Welcome to another edition of Cambridge Inside Out. My name is Susana Segat, and my co-host's name is...
I'm still
Robert. I can't do it right. I don't know. I keep screwing it up.
Still Robert Winters. And to my left, you're right.
Mayor David Maher, and it's great to be here tonight.
It's great to have you here. It's a pleasure. So, David Maher, who is a city councilor, a longtime city councilor, and longtime school committee member, is this term
Hence
been
the gray
elected
hair.
mayor. And it's a special thing because at this time, I know everyone complains about how long it takes for the city councilors to pick a mayor, and this time in the first meeting,
Bingo.
they made a good choice.
Yeah.
And we're happy you're mayor, and we're happy you're here.
Thank
and
you.
Do you have the first question for him?
What's the
We're
capital?
going to do quizzes now.
What's the capital of Montana?
Uh-oh, we're in trouble.
No. No, I thought what I would do actually has worked out with in some of the previous weeks. What I did is I just compiled a list of city council orders that you were either sponsors of, or there were also a few other ones that I think you're going to be playing a big role in your role as mayor. So I thought I would just sort of touch upon them. Let me just, hopefully we won't spend too much time on this here, but one sort of overriding theme that I've been hearing back and forth a lot is about some of the difficulties in navigating the open meeting law. So now I don't think you were the only thing order you were a sponsor of had to do with sort of addressing a particular complaint from somebody. But is that going to, do you think there's going to be any modifications from is it the Attorney General or whatever, or are we just going to have to kind of be stumbling over this for the next 2 years?
I think we're in a stumbling period. You know, I mean, look, I completely understand the premise behind the open meeting law, that you want to be able to do as much of the work of an elected body in public, out in the open, and have it as transparent as possible. I do think that, quite honestly, that some of the tenets of the legislation has gone a little tiny bit too far, where people are quite honestly afraid to have a conversation with one another.
Right.
And
because people would think it's backroom dealing.
correct, and you know that has made it very. I ran into a former legislator today, and I said, you know, you folks were very astute in bringing the open meeting law around, but you also exempted yourselves from the open meeting
In the
law
State House, right.
at the State House,
Exactly.
and you know, I think at times. You know, I'll give you one example. I was at an event, and it was a congratulatory event, and it was saying, it was for Deborah Mason from the dance school.
Yep.
And the clerk ran into the room, and she said, there can't be 5 people in here. And I said, well, what do you mean there can't be 5 people? And she
5
said, you
city councilors.
cannot have 5 city councilors in this room wishing Deborah Mason good luck in her move to Somerville. And I said, and I love the clerk. I said, Madam Clerk, you have misinterpreted the law. That is not the intention of the law. And what I mean by that, and I don't mean to single her out, but I think people are afraid, and so they're taking this too far. And I think what it really means is you don't want people discussing and making policy behind closed doors and then acting as if they're hearing it for the first time. And I'm all for that. But I think, you know, I don't think a congratulatory good wish to somebody who has had a business in Cambridge for a long time is what is meant by that.
Or to be afraid to go to community meetings. I mean,
Exactly.
we want our politicians to go to community meetings. We want them to hear what people are saying. If you now say, oh, we can't come and hear what the neighborhoods want to tell us because of the open meeting law, that's ridiculous.
And what I would say is there's never a problem with 9 city councilors listening to what a problem is.
Right.
There is a problem if you deliberate and you try to shape
Of course.
a responding problem, a responding answer there. But
Makes total sense.
All right. Next on my
Robert.
magic list here, all right, and this is something that you probably don't have an answer to, but what do you think is going to happen, or do you have any sense of how this is going to proceed regarding the controversy of the Sullivan Courthouse?
how did I know that was the question? How did I know this?
Well, I mean,
You're
people
smart.
You know,
worked up about it.
I think that there are a couple of issues here, and I think
What's the
you are right that this is a very complex issue. And I think that I completely understand the frustration that neighbors and abutters to the Sullivan Courthouse have expressed. You know, the Commonwealth went out and kind of said, we're gonna do this process, and they did a process, but I don't think they really listened to
No.
what the public was saying during that process.
Right.
My worry is that you know, if this gets caught up in a legal battle,
It'll go on for
and
years.
it will go on for a very long time. And what I am concerned with is that the Commonwealth turns around and says, you know what, well, we're gonna just make a 22-floor jail in East Cambridge, or we're going to move the Registry of Motor Vehicles and the Department of Public Health and something else into this building and leave this ugly monstrosity of a building in East Cambridge. I think that, you know, I think you all know how I work, and I think it is better off for the neighbors to come together and work together to try to find a good solution to this issue. And I think that there probably is a good solution to this issue, one that will minimize the impact on East Cambridge. You know, I worked in East Cambridge for a number of years, and a lot of the businesses on Cambridge Street have suffered greatly since that courthouse left.
Sure.
You know, the mom and pop sub shops and sandwich shops and coffee shops. You know, you just don't see the number of people walking along Cambridge Street. I think that Councilor Toomey has made a concerted effort to bring the parties together and
Yes.
try to see if there's a way to work this out. And I think, I'm hopeful that we can do that.
Right. And Councilor Toomey, even though it's all nine at-large councilors, they're all councilors for the whole city, he's still sort of the East Cambridge guy.
And I agree,
Yeah.
and I do think that Tim has always had the best interest of the people of East Cambridge at heart. And I know, you know, I respect the fact that he has taken the leadership on this,
Yeah.
and I want to see how that works out.
Right, and nobody really knows how what's gonna happen, but, yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I think it was the Councilor Carlone last week says this could very well end up as a sort of a deciding major court case. If, you know, it's a possibility.
It's possible, and that's what I worry about, that if it gets caught in litigation, that the Commonwealth just comes around and says, you know what, we don't have to
That's
consult
it.
with
Yeah.
the East Cambridge neighborhood, and we're just gonna put X, Y, or Z in that building. And I'm concerned about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good thing to be concerned about. All right, I've got lots more here, David.
Go right ahead.
So here's one, this is actually dated March 24th. It was an interesting one. It was, the order was to ask the community, it has to do with inclusionary zoning. So you put in an order asking for the law department or the community development department to draft proposed language to allow for the inclusion zoning formula to be based on the gross square footage of a project rather than like units.
So, well,
I just wanted to know kind of what was the motivation and what you'd like to see come out of this.
you know, I think the city's housing policy.
You may want to say a little bit about what inclusionary zoning.
Inclusionary zoning,
Right.
you know, it's so complicated, but I'm gonna try to explain it in an easy way. That if a developer a private developer, were able to build under base zoning 100 units of housing, what the city offers is a 15% bonus to the developer as long as the city secures 15% additional units that are turned over to Community Development Department as inclusionary units.
Which usually translates into deed restricted permanently?
Deed
restricted units?
Yes.
All right.
In perpetuity?
In perpetuity. So you would typically, so if you took a 100-unit housing development, you'd add 15 units that the city was getting for inclusionary. So that's moderate to low-income housing that will be available to the city in perpetuity. And for doing that, they get another 15 units.
Right.
So what you wind up with is a building that would have been 100 units is now going to be 130
bigger.
units. But 15 of those units are called inclusionary units. The city's housing policy says we are looking for family units, and I think that's what most people are
Right.
looking at, is that we need 3+ bedroom units. What we're seeing on the open market is a complete shift that developers are building studios, ones, and
Small
twos.
spaces.
Much smaller spaces than what we would want to see as family units. So what this change would do is rather, the city's inclusionary zoning ordinance says that it's
units.
15% of like units.
Right.
So it's 15% of the studios that are built in that building, it's 15% of the one-bedroom units, and 15% of the twos. Well, that may not match up against what the city is hoping to generate. And so a better way to look at this is to say, maybe we would end up with fewer units, but we would end up with more
Usable.
larger units for families. And this would not work in every case, but it could work in many of the instances
So
that we've seen.
presumably it would be subject of sort of a negotiated arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you said that the building was 100,000 square foot building, and you were adding 15,000 more and 15,000 more, and you wound up at 130,000, you may wind up with 15,000 square feet of inclusionary units, but you may only take 10 units rather than the 15, because they would be 1,500 square foot units rather than
Yeah.
1,000 square foot
Now,
units.
one of the other things that's significant about inclusionary zoning is that, correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that if you were building affordable housing purely out of state or federal money, then it pretty much has to be reserved for pretty low income. But we have this flexibility because it's sort of a city program, at least the city ordinances are the ones that initiate it, that the city has a lot more flexibility in terms of getting people with, a little more in the middle income. range.
Absolutely, and I'll give you a perfect example that on the Binney Street corridor in the Alexandria rezoning, where I did a lot of work on that rezoning, they're about to kick off a building there where we're going to secure about 40% of that building is going to be inclusionary units. 15% will be the traditional units, and then the balance, which is a good 25% of the units in the building, are going to be geared towards middle-income folks. And those are people like school teachers or entering police or firefighters.
Families.
And that's what we want to try to do, is to make sure that we're not completely squeezing the middle class out of the city, and that there are places. And you know what? If those are home ownership opportunities, that's a good thing for this community, because you want to keep those people in the community and hope that they are active and good participants in the community.
Now, how hard was it to do that? How can you spread that?
That was not an easy negotiation, but it's something. This is a situation where some people will say, "Oh, you should never do upzoning, or you should never do changes to current zoning." When you do changes to zoning, it allows you to go above and beyond what the expectations are now. And that is exactly how we were able to secure that. Another good one that was similar to that was the old switch house down by the river that Harvard University had bought. And we were able to secure in that negotiation 40 units of moderate income housing that was all targeted towards a preference for people that lived in the coast or in Riverside, and that was a big win for the neighborhood there also.
Yeah, I remember that. Now, all right, next on the list, all right, sort of coming around to the great grand month of April, there were several sort of big items at the most recent city council meeting on April 7th. The big one, of course, that brought out the troops on all sides of the issue. Actually, it was interesting that it was a reasonably balanced bunch of public comment. Had to do with these competing visions for future planning for the city. Some people called it a master plan. I think another perspective is one of simply taking another fresh look at whatever the sort of the long-term plans, zoning code, and growth policy documents assembled are. But they were two different, arguably competing visions on how to proceed.
Well, there were two motions, two
Two very distinct motions. Some
orders.
Right. I mean, my simple-minded version of it is one basically puts the process into the hands of one or two city council committees, and the other one, of which you were sponsor, or one of the three co-sponsors, would have a process sort of shepherded by the community development department. Now, is that a reasonable summary of the distinctions?
I think that in this, I tried to explain this at the meeting, that this goes back to the question about the open meeting law, that there were these competing, but because there were multiple co-sponsors of these, we were not able to talk to one another about it. So we just brought the two forward. And Councilor Carlone, who was the lead sponsor on one, and I have been talking about this, and I think that we will come to a compromise on this. I do not believe that this discussion should happen by city council committee. I think this is not a political discussion. This really is a good planning and community process that needs to come with the outcome of that coming before the city council. But I think for the city council to run this process all the way through is a mistake. And we've had many people who have talked about Somerville or other communities that, Watertown, that have done master plans. In no instance were those efforts led by the city council or the town council.
Right.
They were led by planning professionals. And what I think that you will see is that in the community process, which I think has to happen right away, I think what we will be probably looking at is a independent consultant, a planning expert to help us lead the city through the planning, the community process. And then I think we can have a broader dialogue after that. But, I just want to say that, I live in the Huron, Fresh Pond, Concord neighborhood, and I think we have reached a tipping point. I think there's a lot of development going on right now. And, for many, many years, the people of East Cambridge and Area 4 and Harrington, Wellington have experienced rapid growth in Kendall Square. And those communities have come together to kind of manage the community process. What we're seeing right now in Fresh Pond is that, someone may go to leave work on a Thursday night and they pass by a site and there's no building, and then they go back by it on Tuesday and there's a big building there.
Right.
And I think that much of that development is being done by one company. It's prefab construction. I don't like it. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I think it's horrible. And I think we should be looking at whether that is something we want in this community or we value in this community. Is it the type of housing? Is it the size units that we want? But what I will assure people is that it's not that has not been studied. The Concord Avenue Alewife District has been studied ad nauseum, quite
Yes,
honestly.
yeah.
And it is time for us to go back and take another look at it. I'm not opposing that. But to suggest, for anyone to suggest that this is not, that the city has been asleep at the switch is not really true. I think what we have to ask ourselves is the vision that this city council has the same vision that past city councils have had? And that is, the city council has had a long, long history of promoting the development of housing in this city.
Especially since the demise of rent control.
Exactly. And so if that is the conversation that we have to have, then we need to have that conversation. But, that Concord Avenue, if you take a look at a street like New Street, many years ago, only commercial development was allowed on New Street. The city council made a shift and said, okay, if you can, it allowed housing to be built at the same density that commercial development could be built. And now we're starting to see that housing, and I think people are saying, wait a minute.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we do need to stop and say, is that what we envisioned? Is that what we want? And I'm perfectly fine having that conversation.
Now, that's actually similar in spirit to zoning modification was made maybe about 10 years ago, where former industrial properties and current industrial properties along some of the old railroad routes.
Exactly.
Where they actually said you couldn't you couldn't just build housing to the same density as commercial. You actually got a little bit of a bonus to try and create an incentive so that there would be more, so that it would be a transition toward housing.
Right, and I think the question today is that housing is so, the demand for housing in Cambridge is so great. Do we need those incentives still in place?
And it's a good question, really, and it's a timely question now, too.
Right.
You know, one of the things that I've been sort of speculating here and sort of hoping for is, I understand Union Square, Somerville, maybe all of Somerville is about to get some massive infusion of new housing units. Hopefully with the realignment of the Mass Pike over in Alston, you'll see a lot of new development there. And maybe, we'll hope, some of the pressure on Cambridge's housing stock will be somewhat relieved by the opportunities in adjacent cities as
Right.
well.
Well, and you look at, you look at the governor's plan and his administration's plan, it calls for thousands and thousands of new units of housing being built. And you know, more and more what we're finding is that younger folks moving into Cambridge are not the traditional, you know, two-car family. It is people who are biking or taking public transportation or wanting to live, work, and play in the same community.
Or oftentimes just simply making a choice not to bear the expense and
Exactly.
annoyance of having a motor
But, you know,
vehicle.
I say to people all the time that, you know, the big wave right now is micro units, very, very small units.
Why are those different than studios and efficiency?
Well, they're even smaller because
Are they?
they're like 380 to 400 square feet. And I say to folks all the time, that experiment was done in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Look at our stock of elderly senior housing in Cambridge. In the very small units, and folks that really, really are upset with the, you know, imagine just you living your whole life and moving into a 20 by 20 space. It's really not the best size space. Up at Churchill Apartments, the Burns Apartments up in North Cambridge, you know, the federal government has spent quite a bit of money extending the units out and taking the balconies just to give people a little bit more space.
Yeah.
The same thing with Miller River, and you know, I think I'm not a fan of pushing the micro units. I think it's a fad, and I would think it's going to go away.
I think it's probably a little niche market for, you know, like people I knew in New York City who pretty much home is where you had your bed and you sort of kept your stuff, but then you spent your whole day sort of eating at restaurants,
Exactly,
and living the
exactly.
life.
No,
and
but
doing
it's
that.
like all these new people, they're not necessarily here for the long run. You
No.
know, they're here for a few years and then they're out. And to be in a micro unit, you're young and it's just a place to hang out for a while, and then you go and you get your house or your
And
apartment
I think the
somewhere else.
shame is that they're going to leave once they get a family, and we want
Right, and we want
families
families.
to stay here. So I think we've got to, as a community, we have got to come up with a comprehensive plan on how we keep families. We've seen growth in a public school enrollment, 15% over the past few years, but we want those families to stay here.
Yeah, I think there's still going to be a bit of a niche market, though. I mean, there are people who, you know, I hate to make it sound like we're building motels, but in a way, it's almost like we're building motels. People who are kind of maybe relocating here to get a job in Kendall Square or whatever, and they just need a place.
Right.
And then they might go into a micro unit and then look around, you know, and then leave the motel and then move into a real place.
Right.
You know, I think that you may see that become a pattern. Anyway, it's going to be an exciting thing, I think, you know, if we can settle up our part of the equation to sort of watch the sort of tandem development of the region with Somerville and us and Alston, whatever, to sort of, you know, see how this shakes out.
And I would just add that I think our goal is to have a community process occur in the month of June, so we can go out and gather as much information as we possibly can, and then have the city council looking at how they're going to try to address this in the fall, probably.
No,
So-
we've talked about a lot of big picture issues, but let's talk a little bit about your own issues as a counselor. At the end of the term, what is it you will have wanted to have been successful at? What's your goal? What makes you happy at the end of the term?
One thing that I want to do this term that I wasn't able to do my first term is I would like to see the business partnerships come together. My belief is that we have some of the best businesses in this community, that any community across the United States. And I think that what I want to be able to do is to hook those up in a good way to support public education, our schools, and our neighborhoods. I don't want people driving by wondering what's going on in those buildings. Rather, I think that we need to be able to have, we have the best math and science minds in the country and in the world right here in Cambridge.
Oh, I thought you were talking about this room.
Right here.
The people, the working here, yeah.
But, I think to be able to hook all of our kids up
Yeah.
with good collaborative environments between business and mentoring programs, we can do that. And there's not a kid that lives in Cambridge that if they want to have a mentor, an adult mentor, or somebody tutoring them or helping them in public schools, that it can't happen. It can happen here.
And it makes the employees feel good too.
Absolutely.
Right, I 100% in agreement.
What do you think are the chances of getting that done?
I think the structure can be set up. Many years ago,
10 seconds.
we had the Partnership for Public Education, and I think we can bring something like that back, but at 21st century.
That's
All right.
fantastic. We wish you luck doing that.
Thank you.
And on that note,
Cambridge Inside,
out.
thank you, that was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you.